Bell from Time Monk Radio, and I have Clif High and Melody and Paul joining me. And we have a lot of questions for you, Clif.
Okay, let's see if we can plow through a couple of them at least.
Okay, we're real excited to talk to you. So there seems to be this struggle between globalization and national sovereignty, or a unipolar versus a multipolar world. Do you see anyone winning, or is there something new to replace that, or how do you see that going?
We're at a point of a crescendo insofar as this current period of globalism. So the previous one ended in 1918, and then it took them from 1918 until 1948, arguably, with the MacArthur invasion of China and the subsequent firing by Truman for the globalists to come back to power and have enough of a power base to continue to where we are today. Now, the globalism that failed in 1918 was a 40-year project that had begun in the 1880s and can be almost marked by two events, one of which was the flight from the Mason lodges due to the corruption of the courts in the northeast of North America, and the transshipment of cotton from the Far East over to the USA, marking basically the end of our dominance in the production of cotton and other fibers for the Europeans. Now, when all that happened, in 1918, it marked their low spot. They are at another low spot now, or close to it. And so, in that sense, winning, if it's applied, it's going to be the populace. We're not going to go into a globalist perfect union. And by the way, they were never ever after a single currency, because you can't have arbitrage with just a single currency if there was one planet wide. And they live on that arbitrage kind of mindset. And so I actually think that by 2020s, according to the longer-term data sets that have been piling in since maybe 2006 or something, we should be in a position where we've restarted this innovation wave. And that because we are there, because in the early part of 2020, actually late 2019, the innovation wave takes off again here in the U.S. Now, it cannot do so if we have a central bank and an unsound monetary policy still in existence. And I have tons of long-term data showing that the innovation wave from the 2020s reaches to 2041, which is the limit of the data, not the limit of the innovation wave. And so I suspect that over these next few years, other parts of the data that say that the globalists are going to crash the dollar and then offer us three alternatives in succession, I suspect that those are also accurate, simply because of the amount of long-term data piling in on this idea that we have a true renaissance, if you will, pretty much globally at that point. So it sort of makes sense?
Yeah, so it sounds like the long-term data's weighing in on the side of not globalism.
Correct.
Innovation.
And it's innovating, or the innovation wave has specific sets within it that basically argue for a planet that's living in a disruption model, not a coordinated central control model. Now, does this mean that central banks don't exist? Not necessarily, but it certainly does mean that there is no repression of the innovation wave the way we have it now going around the Western world with the zero interest rates. You see, you have to look at it this way. Right now in the United States, it's probably the best time to start a business and the one at most peril of failing, any business that gets started. That is because we've got a certain level of innovation, and so it's the best time to start because your barriers to entry are low, but it's the worst time to start because the fluid that would keep that business alive is going so sluggishly through the economy. Whether we consider that fluid to be debt, currency, or real money, it all amounts to a velocity of flow that is creeping downward, being ratcheted off by the zero interest rates. And if you can look at it this way, people that are retiring need interest rates in order to live off their savings. They need the interest rates up there in order to get enough money to then have some level of discretionary spending. On a vast millions of people, even a few dollars at a time being squeezed out of them drastically alters the inner exchange between people at the economic level, which is not financial and not fiscal. And so economics is literally, I need your apple, so I'm willing to offer you this 50-cent piece for it or something. And at that level, the negative interest rate's been throttling down on everything. So the data sets describe a crisis period for the globalists that begins this October and continues for a long period of time. So I suspect that an accurate interpretation might be that we're going to have the innovation wave beginning with a serious intent in the 2020s as a result of some sort of a final act, if you will, that removes the ability of the powers that be to control everything sometime in 2018 or 2019. And so thus we're free to go and start recovering and doing those things that we need to do. So the difference can be well imagined if you go to a disaster zone in an island that has been reached by the UN or anybody in a central power that wants to control it. As soon as they get there, basically all recovery stops because everything is legislated. It must go through them, and everything grinds to a halt. And so prior to that point, everybody's out there cleaning up their own mess, getting things back together, and then along comes government, and everything slows down and stops. I suspect that we're at extreme government now, and it'll take another year and a half to die. But it is not an organic movement to try and shove the vast populaces of the planet into one giant homogeneous whole. I don't know about George Soros's intent in paying to have the migrants relocated, to have the people flee the Middle East and go into Europe, but it is certainly a very disruptive thing to occur right at this moment. And it's not necessarily favoring globalism, if that was his point.
Yeah, because we've got Brexit going on, and how's that going to progress, and is that a front runner to other things?
Brexit was actually a trailing level indicator. So when I was in Europe in the 60s, it was palpable. It was noticeable on the streets, in the coffee houses, and the newspapers, and in the placards that were posted all over the pissoirs, all over in Europe, that there was a move for people to get back and basically go back home, settle down, and try and internalize what everybody had been through, the previous World War and the beginning of modern-day industrial output from American-style or American-motivated lifestyles across Central Europe. And so the move there was, the idea in the 60s was, hey, everybody, we're all going to relax. There won't be any more wars. The French won't want to, nobody's going to try and steal the French's wine, this sort of thing. We're all going to separate to our borders and live peacefully for a while. We've been at this too long. And instead, what actually occurred was a small group of people out of London really started maneuvering and pushing for the EEC, the European Community, and the European trade agreements that preceded the formation of the EU. And so in 1960, 61, and 62, they were hotly debated in the press in Europe. And as a kid, I was reading all this stuff to learn German and French and so on. And so I was reading about things that I sort of knew about, and would read articles about this kind of stuff. And I recognized even then that, well, wait a second, you guys are going against the generalized trend where all these people have been slugging each other for all these years, and they just don't even want to live next to each other. Now, if we jump forward to today, what do we have going on? We have that same movement towards separation of people. We have the diaspora of like George Soros moving people around, the same way in the late 50s and 60s was the final part of the displaced persons wave in Europe that dominated for about 12 years. It took them about 12 years to relocate 30 million people, more or less, that had been displaced by World War II. And so we've got a similar set of emotional parameters going right now. And in addition, we also have the idea of everybody wanting to go back to their small country and not be part of this greater mass. And at the same time as that, we have what? We have TPP and TTIP and all these other trade agreements, which are always a prelude to and a tell of the globalists' intent. So they're trying to create a massive unipolar world, and they think they're at their last stage. Now, the real assay of the situation here is that they are at the last stage, but not towards completion. They've actually gone as far as their energies can take them, and they're riding out on the very hollowed edge of the wave just before it finally collapses into its own little tube. And when that occurs, they're going to be quite shocked, because from their vantage point, everything is working in their favor. They've been winning so long, and this generation of the elite has been so successful at winning for their entire lives that they simply can't conceive of any other state of being. And that's exactly when universe comes along and kicks the stool out from underneath your feet and lets your ass fall on its knee as you go down, because the maximum potential for emotional shifts is in existence at this particular kind of a point. That sort of makes sense?
Yeah. In one of the reports, you were talking about defection. And so with all this, it sounds like people are going to defect from trade agreements. Are they also going to defect from banking and military? Exactly.
And here's another issue. It's not really unipolar world, even though the greater United States dollar empire appears to be fairly solid. There's some things that are inexistent that people just don't think about, and it's kind of like the European Union is and always was a false union, and it was actually a confederation. The reason it was a confederation and not a union was that there was no national or federal level debt that was pan-European. So in other words, they did not start off the euro coinage by everybody in the various countries giving up all of their resources to a vast federal empire. They created the federal empire in Europe, but they kept separate debt levels and never created a federal debt or a federal spending mechanism that could include debt the way that we have here in USAPOP. As a result of that, not having this common debt binding all of them, they're actually a very loose confederation that's everybody's bristling under the attempt to make it into a federal state. And the Federalists just don't grasp what's going on in the EU, and that is that without that binding level of debt, quote, that they're a national debt for the EU as a whole nation, then all you really have are all of these countries with their own separate financial systems and financial destinies that are now attempting to be are attempting to survive under the rule or guidance of some bureaucrats that act as though they're like federal U.S. bureaucrats, but they don't have the same level of authority without that debt. It's really kind of funny to put it that way, but here in the United States, the federal government can come along into Washington State, Nevada, Oregon, any of these places, and decide, okay, we want that 5,000 acres over there, and we're just going to attach it, and here's how we do it, and the next thing you know, that land is owned by the federal government, or so it's claimed. And a lot of it is done through the mechanisms of the debt involved, and they don't have that ability in the EU. So when they start getting into these periods where they're rankling under the fascism that's inherent in all bureaucracies, this is the natural result, that they all want to leave. And besides which, they were sold a bill of goods. Okay, so in the late 60s and early 70s, when they set up the EC, I think it was called the European Trading Community, the ETC was the prelude to a lot of this. When they did that, they were selling Greece, Italy, Portugal, and Spain on the idea that they would be able to be propped up by the much more dynamic output of the northern European states in terms of their industrial strength as trade exporters. And it hasn't worked out that way for a lot of reasons. It was doomed, and it was a fraudulent statement to begin with. Germans were never going to support Greece or Italy in that level of sacrifice. And this is what we're seeing now as we don't get the bailouts for Greece and we don't get the bailouts for the populations in Greece, Italy, Spain, and Portugal. What we're instead getting is a sort of I guess you'd have to say, tribute, where they're just taking the sovereignty of these countries and attempting to exploit and recover some level of money from it. These are not the signs of a successful advancing into the future state. So we have manifesting reality all around us right now, saying that the European Union, as it is consecrated today, is doomed, and in a relatively short period of time. And of course, that's going to tie right into the death of the American dollar, because it won't be it's not really a good unipolar world unless there's currency contention going on that you can use to arbitrage and provide power to your currency over others. What led us into a state of the Cold War failing were not the invention of new weapons or our military getting larger, but rather very stealthy currency and financial moves on the part of some people that wanted the Soviet Union to collapse and obviously knew how to engineer it. And this is basically, again, where we're at this stage. Somebody wants the dollar economic union, the dollar Soviet Union, to die. And so we're in the last throes of it. I don't know that I agree 100% with Bix Weir's contention, but about the Fed being behind it all. But there certainly does appear to be an invisible hand that is making things act in a specific way. I mean, look at how convenient it was for the breakup of Europe that it got flooded with all these migrants, invaders, to cause problems at a social chaos level, just at the same time everybody was having problems financially. And the juxtaposition of those two huge waves is really what's going to explode the EU from the inside. They're already putting fences around the smaller countries. Everybody's hardening their attitudes. They're talking about conscription and the deployment of home forces in Germany and in France already. They've got the military on the streets. So it won't be long until they're basically all little armed camps again.
Clif, this is Melody in Ireland, and I have a related question that just continues on very well from what you were talking about already, and that is in the most recent report. You mentioned something that was actually kind of comical but serious in the same way about the Irish banking system and the blowback some of this may have on Irish banking and the particular way in which the Irish might respond, which I'd like you to go into a little for our listeners. And also I just wanted to say, having lived here 20 years, it sounded very Irish to me.
Okay, you're going to have to remind me what we were talking about there. I have a tendency at this stage, I've been so deep in the post-processing, I'm not really sure what I put in.
I don't have the report in front of me, but basically it was about how the Irish bank, the Irish banks would get into trouble, and the Irish would start this meme where they would start basically protesting in a way that was very humorous. You know, it would at least it would start out that way, rather than just, you know, going out in the street and burning down banks, at least at first. They would start doing some rather funny and provocative things, which, if you followed our water protest at all, you know that's exactly how the Irish act. It takes them a very long time to get mad enough to do something, which they, you know, from history of being, you know, dominated by Britain and dominated by other countries for so long. But once they really get mad, they really get mad. And there's indeed. You can't stop them.
Yeah, and the Irish are funny that way as well, in terms of, or not funny, but curious in the ability to take an incredible amount of abuse, and you just never know. And then one day, as you say, they've decided that's enough, and we're just not going to do it anymore, and things start changing on that day. The Irish bank situation is really an odd one too. Both in reality and the data, because the data sets have always said that, well, that Ireland's different from the EU, different from the UK, and yet when it came time for them to act differently in the previous instance of the Irish banking people going crazy in 2008 and so on, they didn't. They acted very much like the guys from Cyprus. And nowhere in the data sets was there this, and it was, it's due to how I coded this stuff entirely, but there was never the possibility that it was, they were thinking about it. They were just going to take their time and work up their stuff about in terms of how they're going to respond. And so I think it's really a case of, as a populace, they let you have one, and then they let you have two, and then they're really thinking about it. And just when you're ready to deliver three, that's when you get slapped down. And so the data sets in this last October report, we're talking about almost a contest or a fun fiesta kind of a feel in terms of how the Irish were going to respond, even though their responses were going to be very dark and very appropriate in that regard. The idea is that the Irish are going to be creative. It's not just going to be going and throwing a lump of manure on the ATM machine or something like this, or they're not going to take the French farmers' approach of driving their tractors and everything and parking them on the bank. They're going to be a little bit more creative than this. And within the data sets for Ireland POP, it was as though there is a whole new level of status, if you will, that will be socially applied to the protesters that get their point across, if you will, in the most literary or wittiest fashion. And so it looks like it's going to be a very interesting period for anybody following Ireland and watching it as this gets going, because the emotional stuff around it forms almost like an internet challenge. I don't know if you're aware of these, but a bunch of people of a particular kind of a group get on YouTube and say, "Hey, look what we can do. The rest of you guys in our group, can you do this too?" And then the next thing you know, you got everybody around the planet trying to emulate this in this weird spreading viral meme. And these are not necessarily positive, but they're not necessarily negative in terms of they just exist. But this will be the same kind of emotional intensity that's going to come out of the Irish versus the banks here. I don't know really how to phrase it, because it's much more rich and complex than that. As the individual people that are going to be involved with this work out their own issues with the people that have wronged them, there's also this now new element to it, in that you can get a bit of social status by not just writing piss off on the wall, but coming up with something a little bit more literary.
Well, that would fit with the Irish mentality, and there was a little bit of that the last time, in 2008. It was just, I think people were so shocked, and it was played as if, as if it were a one-off for one thing and another. Iceland had just gotten into trouble. And
yes,
so there
true.
were all these signs everywhere saying, because the Irish had voted against an EU treaty, and we were being made to vote again because we didn't get it right the first time.
Yes.
And there was a lot of humor about that. But one of the scary billboards was, "Do you want to be like Iceland?" Well, of course, the joke is now, yes, of course we did.
Yeah, you just didn't know it.
Yeah. So, but there was a lot of stuff just even about the second EU treaty, and we're just going to keep voting until we get it right. And I think that you will probably see a lot more of that. I mean, again, there were people who wrote funny songs and people who got on the internet and made funny things about the last one, but it was never quite enough. And I think Ireland felt kind of alone. Now I don't think they feel alone.
Right. There's also an issue here in the data that is describing. So it's not actually describing the protests. What it's actually describing is the situation that will arise from the global pop as they start tuning in, so to speak, to this new Irish expressionism, if you will, a political expressionism. Apparently, it's going to go viral enough that you'll have Russians, Chinese, Filipinos, people in Antarctica that will check every so often to see, what's up, who's winning, and it'll develop this whole social, a self-organizing cooperative on social media around this thing that Ireland just is doing internally on their own. And then like I say, it really catches fire. So the data sets weren't describing any particular successful results in the sense of banks that were altering their behavior as a result of the protests. But it did show that there was a big power shift that was going to go on in the Irish social order, as the, I don't know how we want to phrase it, as the outrageous protesters or, the rhyming rebels or whatever, get their social feet under them with the social media. It's going to, I can't think of anything similar that's happened recently where we could use it as an example, and it's going to be kind of unique in the sense that the data sets don't show it being promoted in any way, shape, or form, but nonetheless, they do show that we're going to get individuals that will rise out of this, that will be famous on the order of, 100 million people will know who this guy is, that sort of thing.
Well, one of the classic skills of the bard was sarcasm, which he could use even against the king when he made a mistake. And that said, I wanted to, Sybil has one more question on this part. So what is the end result for the Irish banks, or do we know yet?
The banks go. The data sets since even 2003 have shown there was going to be something going on in Turkey. It was going to affect an insurance issue in Switzerland, which is going to be tied to a northern Italian bank, which is going to bring down the German bank. Once Germany went, we would have all of the rest of the Italian banks go, and then we would have Holland go and Belgium. Those banks go, as well as the main banking centers in the EU. Ireland fades off in terms of, Ireland does okay, but the banks in there fade off along with something with the Dutch. There's some weird tie-in in the data set anyway between the Dutch banks and the Irish banks. I have never investigated to see if there's an actual tie-in, if they cross-own shares or anything like that. But about the same time that the Dutch banks get this big hit, which is right after the German banking system goes into crises, then we get then we just basically, it all cascades, heading back towards the U.S. with the dollar.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. Sybil, what's our next question?
You talked about the powers that be were going to not choose the Mad Max route.
Correct.
So are they choosing war? What do they choose?
Okay, here's the thing. The powers that be are not 100% unified. So there's infighting constantly. And when we get data sets that come out of there, we're subject to whatever levels of internal energy are going on in whoever happens to be winning in any given struggle at the time. So a good example would be to go and look at all of the documents from the Council on Foreign Relations in any given period, say 2 months, a year, something like that. You'll find that some of these documents will maybe addressing the same subject, will promote differing views or differing opinions on how that subject should be managed. And so if we were to see who was writing the most words about a particular subject and supporting a particular agenda for that subject, then in our data sets, we would see that agenda winning simply because there was more verbiage at this Council on Foreign Relations. And that's kind of what we run into here with the powers that be, because it is such a small, easily isolated, but a small set in terms of what it produces. There's a lack of data, not an excess of it. And so it gets a little tricky with that, right? At any given moment, are we actually reading who's winning in the internal battles, or are we getting the idea of the general purpose and goal of the larger organization? At times they're linked, but at other times they're not. And so we appear to be in one of those latter periods right at the moment, where the Mad Max group are desperately afraid, and they're willing to take the risk of Mad Max because they think they've prepared for it, at least insofar as their individual survival kind of thing. And that's what they're worried about as the banking system and everything starts unraveling. It's going to expose all of this, and these individuals are afraid basically of what we could call emotional and financial clawback by the population. And so that's why we're seeing a resurgence now of the same kind of language, both manifesting out in the greater world, but also in the report. This language had last existed in the period of time around 2003, when we were getting into the real hellhole of Iraq and all of that. And so at the moment, the more vocal and more emotionally intense words are coming out in favor of the Mad Max scenario. But even so, it's easily ascertained that this is a relatively small subset of the power elites that is taking this route. And so there's resistance even within the powers that be for that particular approach. And we see the continuing push for the TPP and all of this, even though there's a group that's basically saying, well, abandon all of that, let's just let it all go.
Wow.
So that is one of those that's like, unresolved.
It's like, let the ship sink with the rats and who cares?
Precisely. You know? We're on our way with a little dinghy to that soft sandy shore over there. That's their understanding. What they don't grasp, though, is, and this is why I've never bought the idea of the guide stones as being anything other than a mind control thing, or the idea of depopulation being anything other than a mind control effort. I never found any evidence of any form that there has been any kind of a practical attempt to do population or cull the herd, so to speak, right? And we have all these people that are afraid of depopulation at the level of, say, 80% of the general world population killed in order that the powers that be maintain their power. And that does not work. That does not compute. It's the same thing as saying silver is less valuable because we've added this additional use of an industrial metal to it. That does not compute. You add something to it, it's more valuable. Well, the powers that be with their idea, or the people that are saying that the powers that be want depopulation, fail to understand that the powers that be have been through depopulation and desperately don't want it. That depopulation was called the Black Death. And they lost tons of power during that period of time in Europe, when the population was cut by 1/3 in the healthy adult male that could do and provide work. And so the Black Death convinced them all to, in terms of the power elite, that they needed a certain amount of these nasty, hard to control beasts called peasants and serfs, just to be able to grow the wheat that they needed to eat and farm their fields and all of this kind of thing. And the current powers that be are well aware of this, and they are also well aware that the further we go forward with our population, it's the only way that they are able to elevate their status even further. So think about the Rothschilds. As a family, it's actually Bauer. They're a German Jewish family that took the name Red Shield or Rothschild. And they are a family in which some, let's say, less than 20 individuals control 85% of all of the wealth in the western part of the planet. And by that I mean the dollar empire. So they control 85% of all of this wealth. Well, if the current population was reduced by 1/3, their wealth might drop by 2/3. And it would be just because there is no longer that huge chunk of the pyramid upon which they sit at the capstone level. And so those parts of the power that be are that you think are arguing for depopulation, I don't buy it. I think it's a meme to keep the population riled up and tenuous and afraid so that they can continue to control us.
Hey, Cliff. A question, if I may, on this. Being in the computer world, I'm sure you're aware of Bill Joy and then his article on Does the Future Need Us? Where do you come down on the whole question that they don't need us cotton pickers anymore?
No, that's all of those arguments are based on a viewpoint that ultimately results from humans being thought of as being their bodies or being mechanisms or machines, just simply biological machines. And see, so that doesn't work. There's whole huge areas that people who think about this at a very sophisticated level realize that these large areas that the powers that be and the power structures require are not physical. Let us say that they're psychic or emotional or energetic. And so you reduce the population by 1/3, the whole planet goes into a depression. Even though everybody has more land and there's more boats and all of this kind of stuff, there's a massive depression for, 2 or 3 centuries because of the lack of that psychic or emotional energy. If you want to, it's kind of a situation of continual growth by the population is required in order, in my opinion, for the powers that be to obtain whatever their goal is, because the patterns that they've exhibited have always been to increase those things that can actually increase the population, and to do it now rather than later. So they were well aware, the powers that be, the financial people that rule everything, were well aware that if you increase the ability of the people, the masses, to take on debt, they will buy forward everything in anything in a pleasure form. So if you give them the ability to spend money now, give me a hamburger today and I'll pay you back next Tuesday, and next Tuesday never comes, a certain curious mindset arises, and you get people breeding more, buying more, building more houses, contributing more taxes, more people to do it, and it keeps escalating. And that's what's built the world we're in right now, and they would have it no other way. And we can't be replaced. See, the thing is that yes, you can get robots to do the repetitious tasks and this kind of thing, but insofar as the powers that be are concerned, they cannot achieve what they need to achieve without the psychic energy of humans. And you'll see them demonstrate this constantly with all their bizarro rituals in like Super Bowls and, the red carpets and all these other weird things that they're always doing at a symbolic or non-verbal level. And all those things don't work with machines on the other side of it. They need that psychic energy on the other side of it. Many of them don't recognize this. They're as deluded as many of the sheeple. They're just serving their role. And so they'll spout off that, we're going to get a few 100,000 robots and tell everybody that picks fruit in California to take a hike. Just isn't going to happen. The fruit pickers are there to pick the fruit, but their greater contribution is their human psychic energy that floods in and does stuff there. Make any sense?
Yeah, that is helpful, Cliff. Because there's so much that you look at it one way and it makes sense. You look at it another way, it doesn't make sense. And you're like, I don't know what to think anymore.
Yeah, but look at a lot of these things too, like the singularity, Kurzweil and all these guys, right? Their arguments are sound and they make a lot of sense and they're just so reasoned and all of this sort of thing. And then you have to say, wait a second, take this bigger, higher look. You people want to turn yourselves into robots? That's not a human sort of a thing, and it does not further humanity. And we'll see.
Cliff, who said they were human?
Well, there is that. That's the really spooky part. Is the more you look into stuff in the ancient literature, you see people like Aristotle and Plato leaving little hints that not everybody who walks as a man is a man.
Yeah, and then to your previous statements there, I wonder about Monster University. The idea that they're feeding off of us, right? They need the energy, right? Fear and everything else. So we're worth more to them alive than dead.
Yeah, you see that.
They want that negative
rituals.
Energy.
Yeah. Well, the energy is just energy. It's not. They happen to use a negative thing to get it up there because it's easier. Because people are more prone, and it's because of our trauma. What was that woman's name? She wrote just a brilliant series of books. There were 3 of them about the trauma that all humans are under, basically from birth on, and how it damages parts of our brains, and how that makes us susceptible to have that energy go out as a result of negative inputs. And so they push the negative buttons because they know they can get that energy to pour out. And if they push the positive button, basically her argument was we would keep that energy in because it felt good and so on. And it's just an entirely different feeling. The small family dinner, everybody is congenial versus the rock concert. And the energies levels may actually be the same between the rock concert, any 12 people there and then any 12 people over in the small dinner, but the powers that be can feed easier and generate easier off of the energies in the rock concert.
Thank you. So I have another question then. So part of the ability to manipulate is financial and with fear. So how is the dollar and the Fed problems going to affect American aggression in the Middle East and then in South Sea China?
It's a race. Basically, that's what's showing up in the data sets. That we sit at the very edge of a precipice of not of our own making, but at least willingly, but that was the creation of the people that run the planet, basically. And so the guys that are running the Western dollar cabal don't want to give up their power. They think they were very close from achieving some or one or more of their major aims, which we don't know what they are, but such things as CERN's Large Hadron Collider are part of that effort. So they're putting in vast quantities of borrowed money and borrowed time. And basically what they were doing was releasing debt at huge levels in order to draw from future production. So there should not be this many people on the planet. We've doubled our population since the last depression in the 30s, more than doubled. And so if we'd just actually been at a steady pace that had existed prior to that last depression, we would maybe have just now added an additional billion or 2 billion people, not having doubled the whole planet's population. But they were able to do that with the debt. And so they were able to draw into the now a future that they desire somehow. And their feelings that are leaking through in all of their material is that they're real close. They can taste success on it. But, and I don't know that they realize it or not, but just at the point of your greatest possible level of achievement, you must recognize that you're always at the greatest possible level of failure. And so I used to pole vault when I was a kid. I didn't have the long enough legs to really do sprints or I was an endurance runner and could do cross country really well because I had good lungs. But other than that, I was just not really well suited for field and track kind of stuff. But I had to do something, so just to get out of the house and stuff. So I discovered pole vaulting. And of course, here's the thing with pole vaulting. You get a stick in your hands and you hold it a particular way, and most of its weight is out ahead of you and a long distance away. You run down very fast, but unlike a sprinter, you've got to run about the same distance in a short sprint carrying this heavy pole that's wobbling out in front of you there. And the goal is to jam that pole in this little tiny funnel that has a hard stop at its bottom that is just underneath the crosspiece you've got to overcome. And then as soon as it's jammed in there, you keep running, but your arms have to start working because the pole is starting to bend. And you've got to start pulling your body up as that pole bends, such that at some point you can get your feet higher than your head and shove it over that bar. And it's right at that point where and you have to think about all this stuff too at the same time, unlike running where you just go. But anyway, so you pull down, and just as your feet are getting up, you have to watch your hands, and it becomes even trickier. You're right at that point of most success because your feet are over that bar, over that crosspiece, and you can feel your body start to arch, and you know you're going to make it. It's like, aha, I'll make it over this one. But then the tricky part is you have to turn your body in midair and push the pole back away from you such that it won't fall and knock the crosspiece off. And so it's at your point of greatest possible success that you also have your greatest possible point of failure. The easiest way for you to fail there is to have a sticky hand, not to release the pole, to have a little bit of wind. There's so many ways you can fail, and yet you're just almost at success. And that's where they are, but I don't think they recognize or have ever really thought about how failure occurs. And so the data sets have always shown, have maintained since 2000, since I first started looking at the economic stuff, that the dollar was going to die. And up until about 2008, it was a continuous language about nuclear war and all this other crud going on. But then in 2007 and 8, it started to fade off and change a bit, and it got much more fiscal. And so we still have at this point a larger mass going to the idea that they're going to fail because of the financials, that at the last moment, that gust of wind that they hadn't anticipated, the crowd yelling or something that just didn't figure into their plans, is going to push the bar over, the pole over and hit the crosspiece. And they're going to fail, even though they've actually succeeded in everything they wanted to do up to that point. It's totally gone. You can land on perfect, you can bounce around and do all this kind of stuff, and you failed. It's unlike, the pole vaulting is a weird kind of thing. It's unlike gymnastics or any of that kind of stuff where a failure can actually get you greater points if you recover from it gracefully and do an extra move or whatever. You just don't get that with the way the powers that be are behaving in their mechanisms right at the moment. They either get it absolutely perfect, 100% into that slot, or it fails. And there is no gray point of failure here. They will simply fail, and they'll be gone, and we'll be back in 1919 wondering, okay, now what do we do? And it's like, well, let's start an innovation wave. We just don't need those guys anymore, so let's take our energy, and now that we're not capped with negative interest rates and restricted money policies, let's start lending money to the bright people to see what they can do with it. And that's where we go. But to get there, we're going to go through some really scary times over these next couple of years, and there's nothing in the data that says that we could be successful other than the long-term sets. And there's where it gets into a problem, too. There's basically the three data types. Any one type has extreme limitations on it. So with long-term data sets, we don't get a lot of detail, just a very broad brush, and that can be interpreted in lots of different ways. With the immediacy data, we get lots of detail, but it's too much sometimes, and you get details that are not pertinent, that never will manifest. They're just part of the froth, if you will, of the future as it becomes part of the now. And so you really need all of them to give you the good picture of it. I don't have enough to say that we've got a solid potential for a good picture for 2020, but I don't have anything in the data sets right now that is a longer-term data that shows a bad picture. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
I don't think he's there.
Hey, sorry,
There
Cliff. Sorry, Cliff. Hey, a question for you. How does that compare with data or trends from, let's say, 10 years ago? What, from a high-level view, how do things look now versus back then? And
I'm
looking
very much
back
more
on
optimistic.
it, what do you? Okay, and what? That's cool.
And it's because of the economic stuff, right? Because let's say that we were it's a weird way to think about it, but it may be actual and it may be factual to think this way in a greater sense. It may give us a perspective. Let's imagine that for whatever reason, humanity in its larger self has decided that right at this particular point in time, we've got to go through and experience, a good portion of our planet has to experience negative emotion G12, okay? And so just because of humanity's growth as an organism, all of us together, no individuals, but the whole of humanity together, we have to experience some negative emotion G12 right at this moment. And it's like, okay, that's fine. Now, we can get G12 with a limited nuclear war, and lots of people die. Or we can get G12 with a very large financial crash, a revolution, and a few people die when the guys with pitchforks finally chase them out of the mansion. This is really what appears from the data's viewpoint, that even way back when, in 1997, 2000, 2003, at these major milestones where I achieved certain things and opened up the lexicon even further, each and every time we still had a potential described that or a potential future described in which we must go through this negative emotion G12. And so the question then becomes, how will we experience that negative? How will we manifest what we must manifest because of our greater destiny? Will we do it, in a smart fashion and have a negative G12 thing that crushes? Let's see, how many people are in Europe? That crushes about 1 billion people economically, all of North America, the New Zealand, Australia, and all of Europe. Will we have that happen, and will we revolt and then do away with the Bauer family, the Rothschilds, and destroy London, and hang the monarchs in the street and that kind of thing? Or will we experience the G12 emotion when someone pushes a button?
Cliff, sorry to interrupt, but
that's all right.
What is the G12?
Sorry, it's just a variable. It's just a mnemonic that we're using right now. I didn't want to name an emotion and get into it, so I just used a variable that we can use as a placeholder for our negative emotion.
It's the negative emotions.
Right, that we have to get out of us. Say that just say that your human body is such that at any given time, there's every 90 minutes you swap back and forth in your body between positive and negative as various different cycles go through. So both must exist, and therefore you've got to go through a period where it's more propitious for your liver than your lungs, that kind of a thing. But sooner or later, in the next 90 minutes, your lungs get more energy and your liver gets less. But you have to experience both of them in order to be a whole and balanced person. Maybe I'm postulating that maybe that exists at the species level, and that we have to experience a particular set of emotions. And so we could even, if we postulate that indeed that's the way that the universe is organized, and it's trying to guide humanity along, because humanity serves a larger purpose than any of us can imagine, then we can then go back and say, well, look, the whole period from 1918 up through 1929 was so that all of those people could experience the H99 good emotion, the big boom time that was around the planet after the globalism had failed, and we started off on the Roaring '20s, which were Roaring '20s for Europe, Latin America, even parts of Africa and China experienced an uptick of an emotional at that time. And so we went through a positive emotional period for a lot of number of years. During that period of time, the Federal Reserve managed to get in and establish and link themselves to that positive emotion, and then they were able to take it over and control it and brought us back into the Greater Depression to serve their needs. So if we have to experience these kind of things just in order for humanity to grow, and that's just a postulate because we have experienced these kind of things repetitiously, therefore I'm just postulating there's a need for it. Well, then we may be at one of those periods of time where we have to go through this really negative emotion. And it will get it one way or the other, because the universe delivers that emotion to us when we require it, not when we want it. Now, we may have the ability to control the circumstances that trigger that emotion, either nuclear war or generalized financial meltdown, leading to basically the same level of negative emotion, just spread out in a different fashion. So let's imagine that humanity was a single individual that was sleeping next to a fire they'd created out in the woods in a snowy time, right? And so the guy rolls over in the middle of the night and he burns the bottom of his foot by accidentally having it touch one of the hot rocks. And it's severe enough that he's got like third-degree burns almost instantly, right there in a big area of the foot. The sole of the foot's covered with all kinds of nerves, and it hurts like hell. And so he can instantly flop his foot over and just push it into the snow, and the heat's coming out of his foot. The snow's melting around his foot. He doesn't feel pain. But here's his problem. There's a certain amount of energy that's been put into his foot by touching that hot rock. Actual certain amount of molecules have been agitated and heated up and destroyed in his skin. So there's energy that's been transmitted into his body that he must release. One way he can do it is to sit there with his foot in the snow, the rest of his body getting cold further away from the fire, and let that heat go away through that snow. But it's going to be a long process because he is avoiding taking the pain and dealing with it. He's putting that off and dissipating that energy very, very, very slowly into the snow each and every minute that he puts his foot out there. But then he has to crawl back towards the fire to warm his body up so he gets warm again, and he's got to go back to the snow, and so on and so on. So he's not going to sleep the rest of the night if he takes that approach. Or he can just sit there and let it hurt like holy hell for an hour or so until his body has responded and gotten all of that pain out of it, and then he can maybe go back to sleep with his damaged foot. Either way, he ends up with a damaged foot. One way he gets sleep, the other way he doesn't. But it has to be a choice on his part to take all his pain at that point in a knowing, aware fashion. And most of us are not. Most of us are the animals, and so we'll keep sticking our foot into the snow because at that point the body mind is in control and your thinking mind is not in control. And so that's where we are with humanity right now. And we've got some of those guys that want us to give us the hot foot, and in this case, their approach is to continually keep us putting it into the snow and suffer that pain, in this particular fashion. And I'm sort of in that crowd. Even though personally I would take my pain all at once, humanity can't take its pain all at once because this time it means someone pushes the button and a lot of people get turned into vapor as a result of nuclear weapons. So, because basically the Russians aren't screwing around because they feel threatened at an existential level. It's not like the previous Cold War with the Russians, where if we were fighting over Vietnam, it was Vietnam that was going to get the problems, not Russia or China. Now we're at that point where their existence is threatened. They're really serious people, and they're not going to respond the way that the powers that be here anticipate that they will. And then there's the other part here. Assuming that we, all as the United States, assuming we all liked the way that things are going, or at least we're tolerant of the way the engineering that's going on at the social level by the powers that be in the Western dollar empire, assuming that all of us in the empire liked it, we still must acknowledge that these people are stupid and doing it badly. that they misjudged Ukraine, misjudged, everything they touch goes to shit. Their ability to handle stuff is just not existent. I think that it could be a case of someone picking particular individuals because of known incompetencies and putting them into positions where they'll cause problems. Or it could just be, the rise of general stupidity over time within an organization has led us to this point. And so the supposition I have is that even if these people do pick a war with Russia, they're going to do it badly and they're going to lose, just like the data has always shown.
Well, that's a little bit upbeat. I was looking for some good news. So if I could go back a second on something, though.
Sure.
I was kind of asking about data trends and all that, and whatever. 4 or 5 years ago, you were talking about a data gap, as I recall, and then there were questions about how information on the internet is kind of changing and might be harder for you to process. Could you kind of answer that? Where does that stand? And then where you see the internet going from here? I mean, there's talk of it, kind of being more restricted and so on. Or for that matter, problems physically. What do you see with the future of the internet and looking back on 4 or 5 years ago and the trends?
Yeah, see, our data gaps and stuff are still in existence. Those trends are still continuing. We're actually reducing the amount of actual textual language that is meaningful on the internet, and we're reducing it from a number of different sources. Okay, so one of the things that's reducing the amount of text has been the rise of video. Audio is now dropping off significantly, and more video is coming on. And even though we're doing, in some cases, closed captioning and this kind of thing, there's actually less energy going into simply typing in material. So at some point, I suspect that my system simply would fail because there wouldn't be a large enough mass from which we could cull the prescient material. But what's kept me going is that there's still new people joining the internet for the first time in new areas. And at that level, as that occurs, those individuals are not able to afford the larger bandwidth and everything necessary to support video, so they have to go through a text phase. And also there's this inbuilt, let's throw all of our documentation on the things digitally move anytime you get a new population. So, for instance, if a tribe in South America who had been isolated yet had paperwork suddenly comes in contact with the internet, they're all going to go crazy, and then somebody in the and enjoy it and everything. But then somebody also in the tribe will say, "Oh, hey, let's put all our paperwork on it," and so we've run into that. So there's still a level of continual growth, but it was nothing like what we saw in the early, say 2000 through 2009. Then video started really moving in 2009. Audio started dropping off in 2011. And see, audio was key because a lot of places would do a audio or speech to text, and so I'd pick that stuff up. But it's also falling off. So at some point, the ability to grab the text is going to go away, but that may effectively be 15 or 20 years with the rate of growth we're still having. And I do think that the internet's going to go more towards video. But there's also going to be this really, I guess, a bloom or a flush, if you will, as we move into the second level of internet industrial revolution, which will be the Internet of Things. At that point, then it becomes possible to create, and we'll probably see collective thing avatars. So in other words, you might have a smart house, and that smart house has a smart refrigerator, a smart phone, a smart toilet, a smart fan, and so on. And all together, they put all their collective computing power together and create a very robust and also reliable personal servant for you that can manage your house for you, so you just don't have to worry. You tell it, hey guy, I'm leaving for 3 weeks. I'm going to go over here, take care of things, and it knows how to, route the mail and do all of that kind of stuff for you. And so we'll get that big push, I think, in the early 2020s as some of the other field stuff comes into effect.
Well, we might have stupid people by then, though.
We still will. But... Yeah, we still will. We'll still have that as continuously. And see, that's actually within the concepts the powers that be have, is that 75% of the population of the planet only exists to breed the 25% that they want to get out, so to speak. That the powers that be know that there's about 25% of the planet that they need to interact with in terms of the population, that the rest are basically not ever really going to be a threat or a problem for them and are necessary. And I came across this number in some of the, repetitiously in a lot of the stuff from Council on Foreign Relations and from Tavistock. And they actually are of the opinion that basically 3/4 of the planet are here to just enjoy themselves through this particular life and, be guided and so on. And that it's only them that allow the powers that be to get at the 25% that really are able to enhance their particular position. This is why I think that the idea of depopulation really is a non-starter from the viewpoint of the real powers that be. It may be in there with, the princes and, some of the Council on Foreign Relations guys may think there's too many humans on the planet. But the guys who really run things are of the opinion we still have a ways to go. Because I keep seeing this number of 10 billion all the time. The 10 billion forms this particular threshold they're aiming for.
Hey, before we get too far afield here, do you ever partake of the, what shall we say, the dark web, the dark internet? Do you ever look into that?
Yeah, I've done that, yeah.
But the not in terms of data analysis or anything.
No, I do that. It's just that, first it's a point of definition. And,
sure.
What are we talking about in terms of the dark web? And are you talking about the dark routers or the dark servers as well? Because there are servers out there that are still on the internet that have no IP address. Really interesting thing. But it's not a particularly valuable area. It's like an intriguing area of your property where there's a skunk cabbage growing. But other than that, it's like, it doesn't really participate much in the rest of the garden.
Okay. Well, that's fair enough. I was just wondering because, as you say, the internet is kind of, moving into things, and maybe it'll just be highly segregated. Any thoughts on this supposed UN takeover of the internet and all that?
No, I don't. I think it's relatively meaningless. It's more of a political move than anything, because the fact of the matter is the internet's run by telephone companies. There's actually in this country, there's 3 places now, 3 major junctions. In Europe, there's 5. And so, the governments can do whatever they want, but it's the telephone companies that actually provide and run the internet. So, nothing's changed at that level.
Well, I always thought that NTT, the Japanese phone company, was really where they had their, what shall we call it, the NSA of Japan.
Sure. And hey, that's where it was here. It was in Bell Labs, and then once we broke up the Bells, it had to go a little deeper. But when I was working at a big unnamed software company north of me, I happened to, when they only had a few buildings on the campus, I wandered past a door and I was asking, well, why is that thing got all those locks and stuff on it? And it's like, well, that's the CIA's door. At least we think they're the CIA. And we're not supposed to ask. So I shut up and never asked. But, so that stuff's been going on since computers first started. And it was actually coming up through the telephony business as I did, working on some of the major telephony breakthroughs like SS7 that actually provides a lot of the internet functionality that we have now by creating 2 channels so you can monitor rates and exchanges as well as allow data. You see where the telephone companies really are at the center, at least they were, the absolute center of the technological revolution. I think that's still the case up to the point of the cell towers, and then it may get a little bit weird once we go into space, because it may shift out of the telephony companies' hands into the space purveyors. But at the moment, it doesn't matter who they say runs it. It's the people that at these particular switch points that actually make it all go.
Yeah. One last question on that. You're now using, what can I say? You're now working on knowledge for advertising kind of thing, or identifying hot words and things like that. This is kind of a new trend and a new thing. How is that going? What are you doing?
Well, it's going really well. It started as a result of my discovering that, I could well, I had some economic issues myself, right? Because I need to obtain certain goals here financially, and I see that I've got to race against time to get these goals achieved, both against my own age and the current circumstances. And so I'm assuming that by the time we get into next March, the ability for me to do business and so on at a particular level is going to be very much constricted by the large crashes that have occurred between now and then in the financial world. Now, it doesn't mean that economic activity is going to come to a stop, but as long as the financial world exists as it does now, it was my goal to capitalize on it, okay, to exploit it, all right? Because I know it's dying. I know that that it's actually a good thing that it's dying, but as long as it's here, I wanted to take advantage of it and get us resettled in a nicer position to weather the much greater storm that will exist from 2017 all the way through to 2020. And in doing so, I looked around for various different ways to achieve that and decided that the way to do it, the most rapid and the most effective, was to take the linguistic tools I had and alter them to meet the needs of anybody that's ever done any keyword advertising, because people are getting, and then when I investigated, I was just shocked that how badly people were doing the advertising process on the social media. And so, for instance, we recently saw Procter & Gamble leave Facebook. That was their largest single account. They accounted for 25% of all the revenue that Facebook had at the advertising level. And why did they leave? Because it was not successful for them. They couldn't make it work. And it's because they didn't understand, and don't understand, trying to market in a surgically precise way as opposed to broadcast. So they were doing all of their usual stuff, and none of it was working for them, and it was just a huge amount of money that was wasted. And you hear horror stories of these poor guys with small companies that go on in and they made just enough money. They've hired a couple of people, and they say, okay, let's try and grow a bit. Let's go in and advertise on Google or advertise here or there on the social media. And, they put an ad together and takes them all day, and then they fire it off, and then they wake up the next morning and they're $136,000 in the hole because of the way that they structured their ad, and they didn't have a clue what they were really getting into. And so my thought was, well, none of these people understand the bidding process or linguistics. So what I would do would be to devise a mechanism and a strategy that it would, my goal actually was ahimsa, okay, do no harm. So I basically wanted to come up with a tool that would at least stop them from tripping and falling into the $136,000 hole. And even if it wasn't particularly successful in raising their advertising abilities, at least it would limit their liabilities by keeping them away from the expensive part of it all. Make sense?
Yeah, I know that when I first started my small business online, I've had a couple of them, I just avoided the keywords altogether. I found that if I said something every day on my blog, it still wound up on the top of the Google searches.
Yes, exactly. Well, you find yourself, when you do that, it turns out in the SEO world, search engine optimization, and that's not really what I'm doing with my advertising, but it's close. Okay. But it is close to that, right? They are an allied area. But I never really cared much about the search engine optimization, because anybody that's going to be hunting for me will hunt for me with a keyword that will always find me. And there's nobody out there just, I don't think, really vaguely wandering around looking for future predictions. So it was never that much of an issue for me. But here's the thing about the SEO. The return on investment for SEO is terrible, because you are constantly fighting Google's attempt to find real humans. And here's their problem. Google has decided they want to present the best possible results in your search, because you're going to probably choose from the first 5 that they present. And so they want your search experience to be so good you'll use Google again. So what they're doing is trying to eliminate all of those people that are gaming the Google system. And so so it truly is now a game. People that were in the search engine optimization business saw that Google used certain algorithms a few years back, and so they decided to tweak their sites, make multiple sites, make all these backlinks, do all of this gaming activity to make their sites more attractive to the Google algorithms. And Google woke up and said, hey, people are gaming our algorithms. We can't have that. So they came up with Penguin and all these other approaches, this other software algorithms, to depreciate all of those guys websites who had been gaming their system. So then it was sort of like people poaching and the king's sheriff out there trying to prevent the poaching, or sheepdog versus coyote. It was a back and forth. And as one tool rolled out from Google, 3 or 4 months later, there'd be a workaround on the SEO side of it. Never minding that the people that are doing the workarounds don't grasp what Google's actually doing, which is precisely what they were doing was looking for you, where you were doing legitimate content providing and not gaming the system. And so Google is in the funny kind of a position of having to try and create an algorithm to find good people. So they're going to have to define good and quality and all of this in human characteristics within their algorithm, as everybody on the outside is trying to game the system and present their attributes as being within that good parameter. It's really amusing looking at it from this perspective. But the advertising part of it it's horrific. These poor guys that going out. I talked to one guy that lost like $9,000 in 12 minutes or something once his ad started rolling, and he was frantically pushing the pause button on the desktop dashboard, and it was another. He said 4 minutes and $1,000 before it finally shut off, and he wasn't getting any results. And then he realized, oh my God, that they're bringing in huge. He was winning all these bids, and he was spending like $6 and $7 to get his ad in front of people that he had no idea he knew that would never buy anything from him. And all he had done was to add a couple of words inappropriately, and he'd followed their recommendation, the software recommendation. Oh, expand your reach. Click here and get this audience that's like your audience. And so it's just a real minefield out there. And I don't see a lot of effective courseware. I don't see a lot of people talking about how to develop a strategy for it. And so I figured, well, I would approach it. And I've been very, very successful. And as soon as we get done here, I'm going to go and craft the next ad for Twitter to run this next week. And if I can keep this up, I can keep my prices down because I'll be able to sell enough ahead of the rising costs for bandwidth, etc. But like I was saying, you're exactly the type of person Google is looking for, and they have to wade through all the people that are gaming the system to find you.
Well, like I said, I just don't bother to pay them anything. And I checked again recently just to see if it had changed, and no, I still come up in top 5 if you put in certain keywords which people are going to put in.
Correct, yeah. But then I also see all those guys out there that are trying to sell now. They're selling SEO services to small business that are actually drowning in no work because they don't understand how to get on the search engines at all. But they come up and they would decide, okay, I can make you the number 1 person on searches. And you end up paying the guy $2,000. And sure enough, he manages to get a search that if you put in these 13 words, your business comes up, number 1. But if you put in 12 words or 15, you're not going to be at that point. So that the gaming gets this SEO fellow a paycheck, but it does SEO a bad service in the sense that customer is going to be very disappointed. It's not going to work the way that he wanted. And I think that they really should just approach it a little differently. Let SEO do as you do. Just do your stuff and let it happen. And then concentrate on the other side in dominating the advertising and not losing your money with bad words or bad design on the ad campaign.
You said you're experiencing some time wonkiness in the data. Are things speeding up or slowing down, or does it appear to be skipping the questioner asked to alternate timelines if the skip timeliness or prior forecasts invalid? Like I said, I'm reading this question off. So basically, it's, I guess, what is going on with the time wonkiness, and does it mean that some things in the past were no longer valid, or just timelines changed on them?
I don't buy the idea of alternate timelines, okay? From a mathematical perspective and an energy perspective, I don't think that there is such a thing as an alternate timeline. And I don't conceive of time in the way it works, the way most people do. But basically the question is, I don't know, or is answered but with I don't know. I don't know what caused it. It's not that it's speeding up or slowing down. It is skipping. That's a very accurate word to apply. It's like a rock skipping over the surface of a pond, or a child skipping over cracks on a sidewalk. It just skipped. It just jumped. Stuff that was in the data just moved forward 6 weeks between one processing and the next, and I have no way to account for it. So the wonkiness as it is appearing, I'm trying to understand it, but I don't have a concrete framework, paradigm, such that I can express the whys involved or predict what may happen in terms of how it behaves in the future. Does it mean that predictions of the past are off the table? Perhaps. I don't even know that. Okay, so here's a really solid example. I had data that said that we would end July outside of $650 for Bitcoin. And I had other data that said we would be at $650 in Bitcoin on the third week in July. I had data that basically led me to believe that there would be a rapid rush up to the 650, greater than that, and then a crash back down to the 650, and then that we would be out of 650 by the end of July. I had this data in some of it as early as December of 2015. That was indicating these kind of numbers for that particular month. But the way that the data was laying itself out within model space, none of the $650 price holding sets, none of those sets that held an actual numeral value of $650 for Bitcoin, none of those sets appeared in the model space until the model space had been moved into July. And then in April, maybe it was late April in the processing for the May report, all of a sudden there it was. The data sets were in the immediacy data, 650 were showing up all throughout that period of time, and then it actually manifested in June. So I didn't expect $650 price range for Bitcoin until July, and here it was. It showed up at the very first part of June, end of May really, and so it was about 6 weeks early. Why it manifested that way in the data and then manifested that way in the emerging reality, I cannot say. I was just able to note that it did ahead of time. I would say, oh, look, all this stuff has jumped forward. And then sure enough, a few days later, all the prices actually manifest. But we met the criteria of that original set. We ended July out of the 650s. True, it was downward, but I have no way of knowing in terms of the linguistics whether it was going to be above 650 or below. And then also, we spent the third week in July in Bitcoin with the 650s. So the data had indeed changed, and it manifested that change in reality. So in that sense, it did not invalidate model space. It wasn't that there was a failure. It was just that it did something unexpectedly. It was like I was driving down the road, all of a sudden it pops out of gear, yet I'm able to jump ahead 30 yards because while it was popped out of gear. I can't explain it. I can just state that it did occur, and here we have the evidence of it. So, and along with previous time wonkiness, I could speculate and say that it's, CERN. There does seem to be some small correlation between the amount of energy being used in the Large Hadron Collider in a particular period when we show data wonkiness, but it's not a one-for-one correlation that I can pick out. And so I don't really have a big explanation, and I have a lot of questions, and some of my questions are exactly those same ones. Are certain elements no longer valid? So, I can speak to some exact examples that I'm sort of waiting to see if anything's going to come from them, but it may be that whatever did cause the time jump, the skip, it may be that it did so by extraction, if you will. Okay, so there's a particular thought I've been noodling that in that 6-week period of time, maybe that existed because we weren't supposed to go through that particular set of emotions. So if we said that, in the data sets that had been forecasting a particular range of emotions with Bitcoin and all of this, maybe something had occurred at some other level within universe, and all of a sudden it was no longer necessary, and so universe, time, whatever, decided that, okay, let's just take that out of the equation and move everything forward, because that's what we experienced, was that all of a sudden we were living in a forward jump that was both seen in the data and then manifest. So it was highly accurate, but I can't explain it.
That's perfectly valid. Another question was there any new data on the Breakaway civilization? $9 trillion is missing from the Department of Defense for 2015. Where did the money go to? And any other insights you might have on that?
Okay, I don't report on the Breakaway civilization as a rule because of a number of things. There's a couple of key reasons not to at this particular point. And so there's been a lot of data about it, but because let's just say that there's so many cross-links over to the Space Goat Farts entity that there's that a lot of it would appear to be speculation. But on the other hand, if we were to look at that speculation, we would see that there's a potential, or there's a not a potential. There's a merging, cross-bordering, creating a fuzzy set between the breakaway civilization guys and the set of stuff that we could say is the dollar death, the whole dollar empire dying, is all cross-linked or cross-connected in there, and they have lots of data sets that are mutually held directly in both sets that are identical. And so they're bound at that level. There's also another set on the other side of the economic stuff, which we could say would be the larger set of data that we could extract from Global Pop, Terra, and Markets Entity that would all go towards, let's just say, the good picture, the better view, the innovation wave. All of that stuff on the other side is also tied to the breakaway civilization. And so it's got merging sets there. Now, one interpretation I have is that breakaway civilization is going to be presented with an opportunity or a challenge or a curse, depending on how they look at it, and they'll have to make a decision sometime in 2018 or 2019 in order to not secure their own future or anything, but they will be facing the same level of existential threat that the population does if we were to go down the nuclear war road. In other words, the breakaway civilization, let's say it was 100% military at this point, had been developed from a number of countries, but in the dark black ops world, and it is basically organized on a military structure. It does not mean that even though they have all of this potential, free energy kind of devices or floaty triangle ships or any of this sort of thing, it does not mean that they're particularly a force to be reckoned with in a war. They may have a lot of stuff that would allow them to escape a war, and they may have stuff that would allow them to fight a war on any given individual basis. But are they powerful enough at this point in time to come on out and tell the United States and Russia to knock it off? Both of you guys are threatening our existence. I don't think that that's quite the case. I don't think they can come on out and dominate. So they're now going to be faced with a situation here in the next couple of years where their existence will be as threatened by the neocons and the neoliberals that want a global war as anybody else. And there's some hints within the data that they may act in a particular way, but it's really speculation, so I haven't gotten into that. But in terms of the missing money and all of that, that I think is in terms of its join between the breakaway civilization and the financial dollar destruction, I think we are, first off, it's the 9 trillion is a temporal marker of a huge kind, and that's why it has motivated my actions in going and doing the advertising to try and get dollars while they still exist and while they're still reasonably valuable enough around here to be able to do something with them. Because I don't really want to try and make things occur in an unordinary world that will exist as the dollar dies even further, and that's in the offing here over this next year. So now the breakaway civilization, as I say, is faced with this particular choice, because as the lunatics up here start rattling their nuclear weapons with the idea that they're going to save their butts by causing a major distraction, then they're going to run into the other guys that are going to say, hold it there. We need to have some level of business as usual. So in that sense, if we want to think about it this way, the breakaway civilization guys, no matter how many weird crimes against humanity, and I hate even using that language, but no matter how many of those weird crimes they've committed, they are really on the side of the generalized humanity and not on the side of the powers that be that may think that they actually control the breakaway civilization. Because the breakaway civilization is really composed of all of these technocrats and corporate guys who want to keep on doing what they're doing. And so we'll see disruption from any place as being antithetical to their growth and their personal agenda. And so in that sense, I see the breakaway civilization as really a big force against the idea of war. I just don't see them at a particular point where they could impose their, Pax Terra on the planet at this point. They just don't have the energy. Even though they're probably got some really spectacular stuff, there's just not enough of them. Not enough of the planet is involved in that particular approach right now. But here they are in their birth pangs, and they're being threatened with the situation of death from accident, really, of politics.
So they have all of the nice toys, but there may not be enough of them to really use them to escape or change things. Is that what you're saying?
No,
basically?
they could escape. They could escape. Okay, but look at it this way: how many could escape? If you're going to go and colonize a planet, it's you need a continuous. Well, colonies are not like seeding bacteria in a petri dish. You don't just put them there and forget about them. Colonies require continuous support for years as they attempt to make a viable life somewhere. So these guys could do that. They could leave, but they couldn't colonize because they couldn't count on extracting calories from Earth, for instance. And so just look at it that way. We cannot, they may be able to, but I doubt that yet even, but we cannot create food out of energy. We have to go through the process of allowing nature to do that for us. And so the breakaway civilization at this point, as far as I know, is still in that same situation as us. They've got to get calories that are grown here on the planet. They're going to eat rice and potatoes and hamburgers and stuff. They're not getting them from a replicator. They're not getting them from free energy. If they are, even if they are, they still need the greater civilization to provide genetic diversity all the way into medicines, this kind of thing, because they will not be able to provide for 100% of their own needs for who knows how long. And so they're very much tied to having us up here. What they really didn't want was to have to come out into the light and the scrutiny and all of this kind of stuff. They're quite happy burrowing away on their own and using all of our money and stealing it and so on. But things are getting so wonky up here that their survival was being threatened. So they had to do the big grab and get this $9 trillion. And in getting that kind of money, now we actually will live through the sudden lack of it. So again, here's another aspect of that that's really kind of good. And that is that as long as that money is disappearing out of the Pentagon and into the black hole of the black ops, and it's part of the breakaway civilization, it will not be reemerging to buy a nuclear weapon to go throw at Russia. So it actually does degrade the potential for war the more often that we see that the military is being bled out by what they must think of as a parasite at this point. Because that whatever it is the American military is funding in the breakaway civilization, however much money we put into it now, is relatively trivial compared to what it would need to stand up on its own as a nation state or a suprastate and even merely participate. It doesn't have farmland. It doesn't have insurance industry. It doesn't have a generalized population to support it. So you don't really fight wars with the military. The United States has had 2, 3, 4 million people that were actually gun shooters, and then they would have 20 million people that were logistics guys to get the bullets and the potatoes and the uniforms and all this kind of stuff to those 2 or 3 or 4 million. Then they need another 20 million that are the financial administrators. So that's really the way it works. The military is just the gun shooters are just the top of this little tiny pyramid. And what we understand from the breakaway civilization is they're basically only the top of that little pyramid. And so they've got to build their pyramid out from underneath them.
So, Cliff, kind of pulling back a little more to the general population, you've talked before that November has been a month for years of potential collapse. And
yes.
What makes you think this November or this year is more likely than previous years? Or do you think it's more likely?
Oh, no, I do think it's more likely. It seems to be increasingly unlikely it is November of next year. And so the initiation point would be November of this year. Now, the November set that was in there was that way back, since 1997, it said in November, the Federal Reserve would become irrelevant to the vast majority of the USA pop. And the way that irrelevant was defined was essentially that there would be no interaction. We wouldn't be using their dollar. They would be trying to do things in terms of running around trying to get us to use their new currency and so on. But the rest of the population here in USA pop was going through some rather staggering times trying to figure out how to make things work without the central bank being a functioning kind of an entity. So there's all of this language in this November set that reinforces the idea of it becoming irrelevant to us because of the dysfunction. And so I've got to say, I've never seen the dysfunction in any markets at a greater peak than I do now. It was bad in 2008, but now it's 2 to 3 times as bad. So given the parameters of what we're looking at and the further long-term sets, the option, we've come down to this year or next year of meeting the linguistics around the Fed becoming irrelevant to the greater USA population. And so it'll be this November or it'll be next November. Even if it is next November, all that really is going to mean is that the November period comes up at the end as opposed to the beginning of this year of trial and challenge that we'll go through as the dollar actually dies.
Wow. So are there any temporal markers? What are we looking for?
Well, the 9 trillion being stolen was one. I'm still waiting for some maturation on a particular insurance company, okay? It's not that this insurance company is in any way unique or whatever. It's just that the data had isolated it as being a temporal marker based on some other sets that have already had all of their stuff appear. So I suspect that is still in the realm of potential. And it was a temporal marker because as the insurance industry goes, that's like the for sure sign that your financial paradigm is ended. The reason that is the case is because without insurance, without an effective insurance industry, you don't really have a corporate judicial system that can work. Because if things can't be insured, then a lot of the attempts to recover money and all this kind of stuff that support the courts go away. And without an insurance company, there's all different kinds of things that you don't have. And so it's really a good temporal marker. And we see that this is occurring now. There's a particular reinsurance company. The insurance companies that are behind the insurance companies really are the ones that funnel money into all of this stuff. And they are dying now because of 0% interest rates, because we have 13 or 14 trillion dollars in negative yielding bonds. And there's the thing. At the same time that we had the insurance company basically coming on out and saying we're insolvent and we can't do whatever it is that they were going to be required to do, that triggers their actually coming out and making the announcement. But at the same time in those sets, we have the larger mass of the emotional energy around the dollar that is all showing it going in a negative direction insofar as USA pop is concerned. And so the temporal marker of the insurance company is like the first drop that comes out of the dam. As soon as we see it coming, then I know that the progression is going to continue, and it's going to get worse and worse relative to the financial separation, if you will, the separation of all of the different entities that are all bound together around the idea of debt. And see, that's where we're at now. In a deflationary environment, debt dies and creditors take the hit because the debtor doesn't have to pay. Now, a lot of these guys are at this point seeing the handwriting on the wall and are attempting to separate themselves from what they're going to consider to be the debtors so that they don't have to be the creditor that takes the hit. And we're seeing all of that kind of activity happen now with the banks trying to separate themselves from the Italian banks and separate from Deutsche Bank and from the Dutch banks. And so a lot of these other temporal markers are here now. And so as I say, I suspect it's this November. If that's going to be the case, then just before the Fed goes irrelevant, we should see at least one day where we get Bitcoin and silver and gold all up over 9% in that single trading day. And at the same time, we'll also see all the equities red globally in all the major markets.
Also, are there any temporal markers that would show when things begin to shift from the deflation to the hyperinflation, or is it just too early to tell?
No, it doesn't happen that way. That they're simultaneous. So we're going to have deflation and hyperinflation exist at the same time, because what's going to go on is that unlike Weimar Germany and that kind of thing, we won't have that kind of hyperinflation. What we're going to have is the Fed here is going to react to stuff in October by going into massive QE, massive money printing, even as the value of the money is already crashing, they'll be printing more of it and exacerbating the whole thing. So, but at the same time, the reason the money is losing its value is because of the crash of the employment, the destruction of the business environment, all the companies going bust, and so on. So the Fed, it will not surprise me this time next year to have the Federal Reserve still buying stocks on a stock market nobody cares about, and to have the Dow at $125,000 US. Wouldn't surprise me a bit. But basically, we'd have to think about the US dollar at that point as being worth, a 20th of a Mexican peso.
Okay, thank you.
And also, by the way, that's coincident with Bitcoin rising very rapidly in the yuan over this year. And so up into the first five digits and then 6-digit levels. And so I suspect that it's because all the currencies are racing to the bottom. So Bitcoin actually, in that sense, is saying that the yuan, the renminbi in China, will also be affected because it's tied to the dollar.
So do you know which of the U.S. banks will fail first, or how that cascade's going to go? And will it spread?
I've got a hint as to which one goes first. And it's one of the favorite ones to hate, but it's not the bank that used to be the Bank of Sicily. It's the other big one. I don't really want to get into anything that caused me problems with the corporate guys at this point, because they're going to be really freaking out as it all happens. But the issue is going to be very much like the previous depression, is not which one goes first, but which one might remain standing. And so in the last depression here in Olympia, Washington, we went into that depression in 1929 with 17 banks locally, and we came out in 1947 with 1. So that'll be pretty much the same ratios.
So will, like, small community banks
That's
last?
where I'm betting. That's what I'm betting on, exactly, is that I'm involving myself with savings and loans and credit unions to do banking needs and establishing all of those relationships, because I don't think anything other than those will survive.
Yeah, we're just watching Wells Fargo get hammered by their own mistakes.
Exactly. You're at the top of an energy peak when you've got those kind of problems appearing in Wells Fargo. At the same time, you have Deutsche Bank, with all of its problems and so on. Everything is so fragile that it is the fragility that will kill the financial system. But there's the good news, guys. It doesn't kill us. It just kills money. Or it doesn't even kill money. It kills currency and debt. And so once the financial system goes, we will indeed have a renaissance again, because it's keeping us tamped down, and they're using it for control mechanisms. And thus they're wielding their power, but at the same time they're removing their power of the future by stifling these generations. Look at the generation that's living with its parents. Never has there been more pent-up energy and demand than you see there. What are these people going to do when they wake up one morning and, there's no bank, but there's also no more student loan?
That would be nice.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I had a question. You had talked about in September that the algorithms needed sales data on housing. And if they didn't get it in certain time periods, that there would be like a data disease.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And
it's going to be kind of creeping onto us, and I'm seeing some of the signs of it now in some of the reports that are coming out of the bits and pieces of the federal government, where you'll see, if you go and look on like in the Federal Register with contracts and stuff, it's where it's showing up at the moment, but it'll be in housing and everywhere. You can see that, for instance, they report a number in a particular category in a spreadsheet, and you look and it doesn't change from month to month to month. And then you go back and look and it changed every month for, 60 years prior to 2 months ago. And so that tells me that they're not getting in the same level of data, and they're just reusing the old figures. And that's going to start compounding as it goes forward. Sort of makes sense on that one? It's a tricky concept.
Yeah, because you actually said that it would have similar emotional and global financial impact as 9/11,
yes,
in a larger magnitude.
Yeah, and see, that's the kind of the way to. It's not going to be like an explosive, the first few hours of a 9/11 kind of an event. It'll be like the rest of that week and onward, where your emotions changed for months at a time because of the generalized collective emotions. people don't understand this, but you can demonstrate that it works. You can go into an office, just pick out an individual and say, "My, you look particularly well today. Aren't you just glowing?" And they will. Their emotion will change, and the whole emotion of everybody around them will change as they change their emotion. You can do it in a negative fashion as well. Just say they look sick or tired or run down, and they'll react to it. Unless they're absolutely in control of their mind, which most people are not, they can't help it. And so we're at that same point here where all of a sudden the data is going to come on in, and it's going to start affecting all of the algorithms, and it's going to impact us all emotionally. But again, the concept is really difficult to get across because the emotions that we're going to be experiencing are going to be as a result of these, of the illusion that has been promulgating for years being sort of removed. But the illusion won't be removed all at once like the way a magician does it. We'll just see it all sort of crumble, like pixelating on a TV screen or something. And so it'll take us a while to get through it all. But it'll all arise because they've been lying about the data so long that the data now is nothing but lies and the algorithms cannot function. And we're going to see it even, I think, into the stock markets, where all of a sudden we're going to start seeing reactions that are wildly inappropriate on the part of the algorithms. And it'll be because some key metric, some key number that they are taking in, the price of frozen orange juice or something being affected by a hurricane should cause this to occur. But because the federal government hasn't been reporting accurate frozen orange juice numbers for years, you get this weird wonkiness where, for instance, you've got all these people betting like mad that the orange juice market is going to go crazy because so much of it was destroyed by the hurricane, and yet the data reflects absolutely nothing. But in reality, the orange juice market was destroyed. And so they just won't know what to do. They'll have lost tons of money, but at the same time, that money would have actually helped prop up and affect the prices of oranges in reality that were gone, but it won't exist now because the bad data got in between. Make sense?
Yeah. Well, I've been watching. It's like, well, I know they've been lying to us with numbers, but it's getting to the point where do they even have good numbers for themselves to figure things out?
That's exactly the point. That's precisely the point. I should have just stated it that way, that the numbers have gotten so polluted, they can't even trust their own numbers anymore, and they don't know whether the number they're looking at is one of their own damn lies.
Yeah. So what do you see will happen to housing, and how will that affect the market?
There won't be a market for that, okay? In the USA POP, we're going to go through a period probably from 2019 until 2041 or something. Just like we did in the previous depression, where the mechanisms for the housing market break down. Not only will there be no one lending, bear in mind that when the bond markets crash, that the bonds basically are what provide the liquidity or the funding that allows people to lend money to housing and the mortgages. Betting against the arbitrage, they take a money on a bond and then they loan it to you at a higher rate and so on. Once that goes, there's no lenders, but also there won't be there's going to be a large unemployment wave as people leave their jobs when they're not paid, or they're paid money that doesn't buy anything. And so it'll be like the last depression. You won't be able to register property, and in a lot of cases it just won't matter. If you go and live in a house in Detroit that's just been taken over and you're fixing it up and stuff, the way the world's going to go, no one will care. They're not going to try and move you out because someone else is going to claim ownership, because there won't be a judicial system to adjudicate that anyway. And although the deeds are so screwed up with the electronic MRSA, the worst of all diseases was not the resistant bacteria. It was the mortgage stuff they did. It's the worst possible disease you can do to a country is to taint its deeds, to taint who owns what. It's such a horrific thing to have happen that they used to use it as an act of war. Okay, it used to be a part of warfare, and the British did it to us when they invaded in 1812. And they went around from county courthouse to county courthouse in any area that they were strong enough to do that they could take over that county courthouse, and they burned all the deeds because they knew it would create such a huge problem economically to try and sort out who owned what, and it creates such big problems that it was just the horror of all horrors for a legitimate state to have all of its documentation removed that way. And now we've done basically the same thing to ourselves. We've burned all the deeds by allowing all of the electronic information to get corrupted and not having standards and so on. And so you can't trust the electronic information about the deeds. And because they were trusting, no one has. A lot of people, you'll see houses have sold 7 and 8 times, but the deed is still recorded in the person that sold it 8 times back.
Yeah. So is it going to be like the last housing crash where we have lots of foreclosures?
No, it'll be entirely different critter. They'll try and foreclose, but it doesn't mean anything at that point because the banks die more rapidly and the courts are gone, so it just doesn't mean anything. So probably from this time next year, I doubt foreclosure will be a meaningful process at all.
Okay. So if you're trying to get a house, you should get it now.
That's why I'm working my ass off. Exactly so. Or wait. I mean, I'm actually at that point. If I were younger, I would simply wait, okay? Because we're desperate to move from an emotional viewpoint, but the house is not so crumbly that we're in now that it's actually forcing us out. But I would wait 2 years to acquire property, and I would be doing it around 2019. Because at that point, you'll be able to walk up to somebody if you've got a chunk of something that's valuable, say a couple of silver coins, or a pure silver medallion that you won at the 8th grade or something. You could walk on up to them and say, hey, I want to trade you this for that field you've got over there with the house and all that stuff on it. And they would say, if they were of a mind to, they would say, oh, certainly, because the real stuff will be so much more valuable at that point, and there will have been no real estate marketing activity for a long time. It'll be very much like the last Depression. If you look at the last Depression, there were a lot of houses that sold during the period of time of the Depression, but none of the deeds were registered until the middle 40s. And it had to do with taxation, and a lot of times the counties not even being able to actually actively register the deeds because the employees were even part-time.
Wow, okay. So I have another question. You've been talking about a big North American earthquake.
Mm-hmm.
What fault lines might be involved and where?
Well, it's the fault lines really are kind of meaningless since fracking because they've just created so many of them. But basically what's going to occur is if you notice, so if you take a globe and you look at the planet Earth on a globe, you'll see that North America has all of its mountains at a particular angle relative to our offset through the poles. Okay, so so the Earth is not...
They go north-south.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but they're angled diagonally, so to speak, okay?
Okay.
So we actually have mountain chain that runs from the very top of Alaska and even out from the Bering Straits, from the Aleutian Islands. They all join up. There's a mountain chain that runs basically diagonally, only it doesn't aim towards Florida. It sort of meanders off and heads down into Mexico. So it doesn't go diagonally across the entire continent. But you'll notice that the angle of the mountains that are in this particular chain, which is the Cascades, the Rockies, the Tetons, and so on, they're all at the same angle relative to the offset of our poles. So in other words, they're almost at the same declination as the tipping of the Earth. That's also true of some of the mountains in the eastern part of the U.S., but mostly not. Mostly the ones in the eastern part of the U.S. are angled, let's just say, differently, such that they would make a Y, so that they would also tend to run from Nova Scotia, Newfoundland area, through Maine, down through the Ohio Valley, and again seem to head towards Mexico. So you get the concept, right? It's as though there's a big V or something with Mexico at the bottom of the V, and then there's one arm of the V goes up towards Alaska, and the other one goes up towards Nova Scotia.
Yeah.
With the data that has been describing what basically amounts to a separation, an earthquake that runs along the big V that goes from Alaska, and it comes all the way down, and the earthquake runs down that entire mountain spine, if you will, down the Rockies. Only instead of going all the way down and just following the mountains into Mexico, the earthquake seems to take off about the square states, Kansas and Nebraska, and thereafter head towards Florida. So that's the geographic descriptors within the data set of a true diagonal earthquake that goes from Alaska down towards Florida. And it's the places that are in the middle of the country there that see the most in the actual topological changes in a vast scale according to the data set. So we've had data describe an inland sea forming, rivers merging, all of this kind of crud, as a result of basically what amounts to a subsidence. not necessarily even a big subsidence in terms of might not be more than a few inches in some place and a couple of feet in some other place, but because it affects such a large area, there's basically a new giant depression that's been created, and so all the flood plains and everything change. At the same time,
affect our rivers, yeah.
Correct, and at the same time, on the other side of the earthquake, on the other side of the spine of those mountains, we get seriously shaken up. So it's the earthquake is described as traveling diagonally. It hits in summer. It's repetitious, meaning it's not just a single earthquake in a single day, but it's a bunch of earthquakes over a bunch of days. And on the west coast, let's just say from the spine of the Rockies towards the ocean, the effect is going to be shake, rattle, and roll until all kinds of stuff just falls down because we've exceeded its ability to deal with the stresses of moving back and forth. Whereas on the other side of that spine of the Rockies, what appears to happen is as though a giant subsidence, a huge bowl that it forms. The bowl would go from the edge of the Rockies in Kansas, Nebraska region all the way over to the Great Lakes. And so will the Great Lakes have a tendency to drain towards the middle of that new bowl? Maybe indeed. I know all the rivers, Red Rivers and Mississippi and Missouri and all these are all referenced. Doesn't mean the earthquake's going to happen. It just is being described this way within the data sets, within Terra and so on. It may be that there's, something that comes close to that in terms of where it affects, but the level of intensity is nowhere near what we anticipate now. And the reason that is simply because it's spread over such a broad popular base. So let's imagine it this way. If you get a nasty earthquake in California, you've got, in Southern California, you've got 18 or 20 million people that feel it, and so you get a big emotional response from that. Even if the earthquake is relatively locally isolated and does very little damage, all of us really react to it, like Northridge or something, because it's all part of the news and everything. So imagine that spread over an earthquake that would affect the whole of the nation. We might not have a major amount of damage to still yet have millions and millions and millions of conversations that go on forever because so many people were personally affected. And a lot of them will have never, ever, ever experienced an earthquake. That's the key part of this stuff. Within the data sets going back maybe as long ago as 2007, I'd have to look and see when it first appeared. That was the first hint that something was going to go on. It was the data sets were describing an earthquake that would affect the USA pop, where the majority of people affected would have never, ever experienced an earthquake in their lives.
So it could be fairly small Richter scale in effect.
Correct.
Wow.
But we have also in the Terra entity, there's all this other crud that seems to suggest that at one point a river goes dry because it's headed off some other place, and as a result of going dry, 5 or 6 nuke plants are wanting for cooling water. That's not good. So we may have a situation where the earthquake itself might be relatively minor, but some of the damage that could result from it could be quite terrible.
And so timing-wise, it's
still by summer. It's past the solstice in June, and it appears in the data sets to have occurred by the time we get to the equinox, or is occurring still at that point. Because, of course, you have to understand that with the way data presents itself, it's very much like the actual earthquake. We get earthquake language, and then we get all kinds of language about the earthquake that continues on, probably as a result of all the aftershocks and stuff. So here we had, and let's go back and look at the last big earthquake prediction. That was the Banda Aceh quake. Okay, we had that 8 months in advance. And it was a horrific earthquake, and it had 300,000 people killed and a nation knocked back to a previous age, as the linguistics said. So just given that, we can anticipate right now that because we've had this earthquake so long, it will indeed affect a large mass of people. And that's really the only thing we know for sure, because we don't have data saying, a nation kicked back to a previous age, or electricity. We do have things about electricity being shut off and nuke plants and so on. But we don't really have anything that says, 300,000 people dead or anything like that. So I'm suspecting that maybe it will be such an earthquake. It'll be an earthquake that causes all of these people to have this huge amount of emotion, and it really upsets the nation, but that the earth, and causes all kinds of problems, including maybe nuke plants, but that the earthquake itself will be a relatively low-key event.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I got a question about another earthquake, which would be called New Electrics.
Yeah.
How's that looking? Can we buy it?
It's
Is it
always
cold
been focused.
fusion? What do you think? Where do you see that? What is going on with that?
Okay, I don't think it's the Keisha stuff.
No, I meant the LENR. You know what I mean, cold fusion
right,
stuff.
Right, right. No, and I actually do suspect that it is cold fusion that we're talking about, or subsonic solar luminescence or whatever, how they are describing it now. Cold light, in essence, creation of cold light. And so because of the light component, because of all the words...
Sounds lunar or something, doesn't it?
I know, but it's actually... Exactly, but they're talking about it now in non-English languages, in Russia, Chinese, and German even, about basically cold fusion, and are developing devices for it. The current problem at the moment, and it is a problem, is that cold fusion is being pursued in its real manifestation by corporations. So they're looking at it as, how do we make this and charge for it? The way in which the data describes it is that it won't be coming out of the corporation world, that it actually will be coming out of somebody like Keisha, somebody that's, on a fringe element, although I don't think it's him for a bunch of reasons. And that once they start making the devices, then it gets to the point where everybody starts making them really quick. And so it sort of spreads because there's not a first mover advantage at a corporate level. So it's not going to be like cell phones in that regard, where the first mover has the big edge on it, because I guess the technology, once it's out there, is going to be so relatively easy to construct that lots of people will do so, and they'll make money at it and so on, and that's how it's going to spread. We're still looking at 2019 because for actual mass use of the starting of the devices, because we still have yet to see one of the key temporal markers for this, which was the beginning of the description of the language for this new field physics, or whatever we're going to call it. So part of the new electrics goes to the idea that we're going to get to the point where we can manipulate energy in fields. So instead of, for instance, sending electricity down a wire, we could send it across the surface of a plank of wood if we wanted, by knowing how to manipulate the electrical field itself. And so once we have the language around that showing, then we'll know we're within about 18 months of the first devices coming out. Make sense? And I've seen some of that language, but not enough to hit even the mainstream science magazines yet.
Well, are there mainstream science magazines anymore? But
arguably, but I'm not even talking about them. I'm not talking about like the science journals or anything. I'm talking, for my way of thinking, a mainstream science magazine is actually like The Economist, or would be like
sure.
Someplace where money actually is involved in the science, because that's what basically constitutes mainstream and success and so on. And I've seen some hints, for instance, in some of those kind of magazines. One for the mining industry out of Germany the other day was talking about some stuff that I believe is the precursor to language about this dissolved minerals in place technology that will soon be appearing, which is a subset of the new electrics.
Oh, hey, I got a related question. Deep sea projects, like Japan's into the looking for methane or whatever. Any data or anything promising from your point of view coming out about deep sea stuff?
Sure. There's some really cool stuff coming out. There's a method that the Chinese have of basically, it's also part of the new electrics, although it's a very mundane technology. The Chinese have come up with a way of using cold water to make basically perpetual electricity at a significant level, and it's scalable. So they use these big pipes on the islands, and where you've got some nice depth to the water, and it's sort of like a heat pump that produces electricity. And we're going to see those all over, and one of the key markers we're going to see pretty quick is going to be an Irish company that's going to sign with China to do some exploration off the western coast of Ireland. And that's going to turn out to be just a huge energy boom for Ireland, and Ireland overcomes a lot of their economic issues as a result of going sand hog. Okay, and I say that because in the building of the subway system in New York, the vast majority of the people that were the sand hogs, that's to say they went down below the street level and lived in this dangerous and very air compressed environment, digging the tunnels. The vast majority of people there were Irish in the initial tunnel digs. And so they're sort of sort of weird, in a weird way, they're going to rhyme with that, join with the Chinese, and start doing these tunnel system things off the coast that will make energy that they'll sell to the rest of Great Britain and then later on across into the EU. And the Chinese are successful with that now on a lot of islands off their coast. So it's actually happening. It's actually coming on out. We're not so innovative here as to be following the Chinese lead, but we actually have coasts that in Maine and up here in Alaska and off the coast of Washington that we could achieve that, where we could put these big tubes down there and they would be, kilowatt or megawatt generators, some serious gigawatt generators as well. And there you go, electricity just flowing like mad as long as you can keep that tube going.
Well, we just have to find a way to give those areas to David Rockefeller. And,
yeah, but see, there's part of our problem, Guy, is that it's not going to happen here in the U.S. because the money has been polluted, because they've destroyed the money. We're down to that last fraction of a penny of value in the dollar, and we can't get out of it. And everything that they will offer will simply be yet more paper. So until we get through all of that stuff and come out the other side, we won't be the innovators. So our innovation wave here in the U.S., we pick up in 2020s, but we're still trailing the world at that point.
Oh, for sure, for sure. Hey, Sibel, you want to take it in now?
So, this is our last question, but you talked about, a renaissance.
Yeah.
And the U.S., we had manufacturing, and then we switched to finance and, healthcare as our productivity. What's next? Energy.
That's where the Renaissance gets everything. Well, no, not really. The Renaissance outside of the U.S. Starts biological. So there'll be a huge boom in like do-it-yourself biology stuff that'll come out of Asia, and that'll be the one of the major temporal markers that we'll know that we're about to experience our part of the Renaissance, because the U.S. and the data sets the data sets portray it this way. Because the U.S. has got destroyed money, we have a 4 or 5 year gap between us and the rest of the world as we have to work through all of our problems here. But that gap, in a way, is going to be just what we need, because we won't be the followers of the rest of that world, and we'll go off and work on something else on our own, which will then join in. So, in other words, the data shows China, Southeast Asia, Philippines, Malaysia, Singapore, and even parts of India getting into do-it-yourself biology stuff and producing all kinds of new products, and it's just an innovation wave, right? And so, for instance, some of the products are really strange. If you actually looked at the descriptions, it would be like a bacteria that could take some bacteria, put it with some mud, and it'll grow you a big lump that you can hollow out and make into a house, that kind of thing. So it's just strange kind of uses for biology in an industrial fashion, if you will. And then the U.S., though, because we're in the dollar hurt, we can't buy things, our infrastructure's collapsed, we're trying to basically get ourselves out of the pit that we created, and are very much similar to Russia trying to crawl out of the remnants of the Soviet Union. We have to go through that whole process, and it'll take us a lot longer than Russia did, but we'll see some benefit, some beginning of that in the 2020s. And what the data showed for the U.S. was that we go into field manipulation, energy field manipulation. And so while Asia is off doing biology stuff, we're going to have some quirky guys around here. They're going to figure out ways to do things and make energy behave as in ways it does not do now, such that we'll be able to have standing fields that can be manipulated in particular ways. So let me give you an example. Right now we might use a forklift to lift a pallet up into and down from a storage container area in Home Depot. But by, say, 2024 or 2025, we'll use this little thing that looks like a sheet of paper, and you put it underneath that pallet, and then you go back to your little handheld control, and you energize that thing in its field forms, and then you shape the field to be like a series of columns that then lift that thing up to where you want it to go, and then it's pushed over into the bay. And so you don't have the forklift, you don't have the energy it was consuming in making the forklift. Instead, you go right to the manipulation of the energy necessary to lift that particular item. And so there's going to be like field physicists, a whole new level of physics, and whole new colleges, and in an industrialization that will sweep the world in a way that is like perhaps thousands of times more energetic, pun intended, than the first industrial revolution, where first we had to make all of the machine tools before some master machinist could make you the precision stapler you needed to staple your auto upholstery kind of stuff. Here we're going to avoid all of that and go right to making the auto upholstery stuff staple itself. Sort of makes sense?
Well, it's fascinating, but like, I don't. How are the universities we have now? I don't see them producing those people.
No, and you see, we're actually going to get away from all of those kind of things. They're going to die as a result of the debt as well, and so the grand Ivy League colleges and stuff are in their last years. But we're going to form or universities. We're going to actually form real colleges, though, where the shift will be from, let's say, the non-sciences, okay, human resources and all of that kind of stuff, into desperately need science and machining and the math kind of thing to survive skills. So the descriptions of what we've got basically would seem to describe an internship or vocational school system emerging. And it'll emerge out of desperate need from those people that are actually making money and surviving, being successful at it. So one of the first colleges that was ever created for agriculture that was effective on this planet was done by John Deere. And John Deere did it because they needed the people that they were selling their equipment to use their equipment better. So they created an educational system that was a series of newsletters and stuff that went along with the sale of their equipment. And that's the kind of thing that's being described emerging out of the remnants of our financial system over these next couple of years, is that it's desperately needed that people understand, and there'll be some guy who wants to learn how to weld or machine and stuff, and even if there isn't a college, he'll find somebody to teach him, and from there you get the idea and off it goes.
So real skills are going to start having currency.
Yeah. And so we go into a backwater, so you see that in the data sets, if you were to look at the USA pop, it would look very much like Mad Max world. And if you just took that in isolation, you might think the whole of the planet was headed that way. When in fact, it's going to be, the beginning of what may be 6 centuries of flowering out of China, in terms of new ways of doing things for humanity as a whole. And so if you looked at China, you wouldn't necessarily even see that 350 million people here are going to be in dire straits for 22 years or something. It's really difficult then to not get lost in the minutiae, so to speak, and to maintain a large enough view to say that, oh yeah, okay, look, it's going to be really the pit here in the U.S., but hey, give us a few years and we're going to come back with a whole new science that nobody's ever thought of before.
Yeah. I work in a rural community, and I met an old guy, and he came up with an idea for driverless cars back in the 80s. The guy asked him, how did you know about that? And he said, well, he grew up in Cave Junction, Oregon, and if you couldn't make it, you had to figure out how to make it, and if you couldn't figure out how to make it, you had to figure out how to live without it.
Right, or make something else that would take its place. Yes.
And we need more of those old guys.
Well, that's actually a function of human character, because there's the flaw in dealing with men, especially young men today. Okay, if you were to look at the United States today, it's filled with young men that don't amount to much. They don't amount to much because the circumstances have put them living in their parents' basements with a depressed mindset and all different kinds of problems that are setting on them. But that's who they are now. That's not the men they're going to grow into. And you are who you are and you have your character. Circumstances don't create character in humans. They merely bring it out. So we've just had no circumstances here because of political correctness and social justice warriors and all this nanny state stuff. We have had no circumstances for a number of generations that to bring that out and create the leaders that we're going to get here in the next few years. But the circumstances can only be held at bay for so long, and then when they pop, those people will react as they were set to react by universe. So I don't really worry about the population here in the U.S. There's going to be people that won't do well, that's for sure. But there are going to be people here that will emerge from having not done well for decades, perhaps, to really be some, bright shining examples of what we need. And it always happens that way. So it's like, like the Taoists would say, when things are at their most extreme, they've already started to change.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I've totally enjoyed our time together here.
Sure. Yeah. Glad to. Wish we could do more of it, but, there's only so many hours. Yeah.
Universe and all that.
Exactly so. Yeah. That bastard is always pushing us around. Yeah.
Well, good luck with the house and all that.
Yeah, we think we found a solution. We're going to try it. It's, in the times we're in, it's an act of desperation and hope at the same time to think that, okay, we can maybe, I'll just go into it a bit here. Some people, when I was in Europe, I spent some time at this marvelous inn that turned out to have been a stable and a barn for a place that was up the road a ways. And so a lot of houses there are old chicken coops and this kind of thing. Well, Kathy and I found a place and it's an old oyster house. And it's a place where they would raise algae and oyster spawn for an aquaculture company. And we're going to see if we can't get the county to let us remodel that into a house. We'll see.
Lots of people here in Ireland live in what they call barn conversions and shed conversions, and haven't heard of anybody doing it with a chicken shed yet. But, what we call outbuildings, a lot of houses just had them. And we've actually turned one of our outbuildings into sort of a medieval feasting hall for our friends. And, it works. Sometimes you have to be really careful, with zoning and weatherizing.
That's our problem, is the authorities, correct?
Yeah. It's much worse in England than it is here. Here you just kind of do it and then don't tell anybody and nobody notices for the most part, unless you go to sell it. And then you have to take it down.
then you got issues, right. We have that same sort of thing here in some of our counties because in Washington we're still sort of rural. But we do have Agenda 21. It's moved into a lot of these counties here, so they're clamping down on a lot of that stuff. So basically it's a question of if the authorities won't permit it, we probably won't even try and change their minds. Just because we don't want to go up against that, we'll look for some other opportunity. But at the moment, the opportunities in real estate are trash around here because of what the central bank has done these past 10 or 15 years. Yeah.
Well,
so it'll work out the way it's supposed to, though.
Great.
Sounds good. Anyway, thanks so much for your time and efforts.
Sure thing. Thank you, guys.
It's been a great evening.
Yes, thank you much. Bye.